Good morning, everyone. I'm Caroline Gilwood, and I am the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Lead at Royal Voluntary Service. And we're delighted to be joined today by Mark Francis, an expert stitcher from the Great British Sewing Bee and Sewing Street. So hello, Mark, and thank you so much for joining us here at the Virtual Village Hall today. And I know that you visited us here before at the Virtual Village Hall because, of course, during Men's Health Week, when you were encouraging men to try some mindful sewing.
Oh, yes, I did. We did mindful sewing. I think I was threading a needle and putting a button on, and those nice little simple repairs. Yes, and I did a talk about mental health and my own personal journey. But thank you for having me back. Thank you.
Well, it's really lovely to meet you, and I'm really hoping that you'll be able to answer some fabulous questions by our watchers today. But you're here today as part of LGBT History Month, which obviously was in February, and it's an important occasion for us all to promote equality, diversity and inclusion.
Well, it is indeed, and it's. I'm sorry I couldn't be here in February is the first thing, I suppose. Just the way the diaries fall, unfortunately, and March is a busy one for me as well. But it's good to be here to do it just a few days late. We're only the 8th or something, aren't we? So we're only a week late. But there's never a wrong time, is there, to talk about these kind of things?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And if it was up to me, it'd be LGBT History Day every day. Anyhow, the theme for this year's LGBT History Month is Behind the Lens, and basically it's celebrating the contribution that LGBT folk have made to cinema and film, but from behind the camera. So directors, script writers, and people like costume designers and makers. And you are our perfect guest.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's something that I don't know. I love the creative side of it. I love the costume. It always has interested me enormously. Even before I was sewing, really, I was very interested in the costume part of it, and the kind of the thought process, the way the things come together, the inspiration, the different types of stories that people will be drawing on. And there's a great deal of LGBT plus people that work in that community and in that field to be able to bring that together. Not just costume designers, but from everybody, whether they're a witty knitter or they're there just pinning things and or whatever. But there's a whole range of people that go in to put these things together.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I guess for us who are not familiar with what costume designers and makers do in the world of TV and film, can you maybe tell us a little bit about what the job involves and what your work specifically is? But just before you do that, Mark, just to the audience, do remember to put questions in for Mark in the comments, and we'll get to as many of you as we possibly can at the end. So yeah, over to you in terms of telling us a little bit about what costume designers and makers do in the world of TV and film, Mark.
Well, the role of this and how people would come by their different work and build up their portfolio has changed quite a lot over recent years and decades. A lot of people in film and TV now work freelance. So it could be that it's you will build your career about people that you know, and you'll apply for the roles, and so you can kind of forge out a bit more the kind of avenue that you like. Maybe you specialize in historical costume. Maybe you look to do more things that are more kind of more of the moment or of today, or maybe a bit more kind of out there and more futuristic or sort of left field kind of field costume design. But back in the day, if you were working for an organization like ITV or one of their little companies, one of the subsidiaries they used to have, or the BBC, you would be very much kind of told, you're doing a Zcast next week, and then you'll be off doing the Need-In line, and then you might be doing a Doctor Who. So those kind of, in that kind of era, kind of the 50s through to about kind of the 90s, you would be talking people who had a wide experience of working on a great different number of programs and shows, and some of them they'll find a lot more enjoyable than others. So, I mean, you have the costume designer, of course, who will be maybe the lead person on a project in putting the looks together for the different cast. And then you'll have costume or supervisors who will work underneath them, and then you might have a team of people who are there actually making the costumes, or you might be subcontracting stuff out to more bespoke makers in some cases. So if you had a leading person, you might choose to have their costume tailor-made. Depending on your budget, you might be going to Savile Row, or you might not. Or you might choose the team at the BBC workroom, as it used to be, to go and put something together. But the costume designer in particular will be working quite closely with directors and producers to come up with the look that they're after for their particular project.
Oh, that's really interesting, Mark. And of course, the costumes in TV shows and films often play a major role, don't they, in their own right? So if we think about shows like Downton Abbey or The Crown, or even Baz Luhrmann's Elvis spring to mind. And what are your all-time favorite films and TV shows for costume design, and why, Mark?
Well, yeah, the costumes are very integral to these pieces. I mean, Downton's it is a costume drama. So it could be that I think most things on that series, from my understanding, are made or tailored for them. And we're very lucky if you go to places. I think I saw one in Bath. I think it might have been an exhibition of costumes from Downton Abbey. But they have to be careful what they display and not to give away plot details that may be coming up in the future. I did hear a story that someone got into trouble because they displayed a certain item amongst the menagerie of costumes that were giving away a plot point. But my all-time favourite, which I've got some pieces juggling around the back of my head here, is Doctor Who. As a programme, something that was always on in our house. I've got a brother and sister much older than me, incredibly old they are, incredibly old.
Oops.
They won't be watching, so it's fine. Well, there might be, I don't know. Anyway, they're about 10 years older than me. So their story as they were growing up is quite different to mine. So I was a child of the 80s, born in the late 70s. But Doctor Who was kind of on in the background, and Paul, my brother, would have watched it. And so I watched it by default. Just because of the breadth of the stories and the places they go to within those stories and what they're trying to tell, it brings such a wide variety of costumes, everything from Stone Age men through to period pieces, through to stuff though where the costume designers really having to think outside the box in terms of their budget, what they can achieve, and what they're trying to and the look they're trying to go for.
Well, it's very clear to me that Doctor Who is something of a passion of yours for sure. And it sounds like a real source of inspiration as well. So maybe tell us a little bit more. I want to tweak out a little bit more about the work that you've done, designing specifically commissioned garments for, I think we pronounce it Whovians. I think I've got that right. And because I believe a Whovian is an avid Doctor Who fan, isn't it? That's definitely a new word for me.
They answer to many names. That's not the one my mother gave it. she was a little more derogatory. But interestingly, with my mum, is that she couldn't stand it when it was on in the 70s and 80s. She didn't have time. Oh, didn't have time for it. It was silly and childish, and she couldn't be doing with it. She didn't know why I enjoyed it. But then years later, when she's passed away now, but when she saw stuff by Matt Smith and David Tennant, she absolutely adored it. And then she went back and watched, because I made her, older stuff from the 70s and 80s, and then she really enjoyed that as well, which was, so it just goes to show that maybe she wasn't watching the first time. Yeah, so it has really kind of sunk into my DNA in a lot of ways. And there's the ideas they got for the stories came from all kinds of places, quite surprising places. an Escher painting where you got those kind of impossible steps going down and down. That sprung a whole story. There might have been taking ideas from old science fiction novels, Frankenstein, for example, and just taking bits and pieces and ideas and elements and reworking it. There's a great story in the 70s where someone had a really bad tax return and they were so angry about it they wrote an entire commissioned story for the series about tax, about how we were taxing people to death, and he had to tax people to bury them even. The stories come from all over the place, and it changes as the series has been on for such a long time. You get different areas have different feels, like a very comic book era kind of in the late 80s, for example. But what we did in the 60s was completely different in black and white telly, almost like weekly rep when they were doing it back in the 60s. But the costumes themselves come from all kinds of different places. Sometimes they'll be specially made, sometimes they'll come from stock. So they'll go to places like Angels, and various of the costume houses that don't exist anymore have been all kind of come together as one big place these days. But they would go and they would hire costumes as they needed them per story. Or as I've learned more recently, was I was reading the biography of William Hartnell, who played the very first Doctor in the early 60s, but he had a fascinating career ahead of that. He's famous for playing a lot of policemen and army types, but he was there at the beginning of silent films, working his way through to an awful lot of films in black and white before coming to Doctor Who in the early 60s. But he was an actor of a generation where they would quite often supply their own costumes, not just to stage, but also to films as well. And he recounted a story after he'd left Doctor Who, and he was quite cross about it. The black jacket that he wore in the series actually belonged to him. And he brought it along, and it was his piece, which he presumably wore on stage in numerous times as well. But he was so livid because he never got it back at the end of this after he left. So where it is now, I don't think it's been seen since 1966, but the design of it is beautiful, really beautiful. Double-breasted with 12 buttons, 2 rows of 6 down the front, a shawl collar. It fits him really beautifully, it really does. Never been seen since, to my knowledge anyway. But these things pop up in all kinds of places.
Absolutely. And am I right in understanding that you actually make costumes for fans of Doctor Who, or Whovians, as some people call them?
I do. And part of my love for doing this is bringing these pieces, these items of clothing to people, and you have the choice. You can either use it as costume, so you can dress up as your hero, or you can, like I do quite a lot of the time, you can just wear them as clothes, just an individual piece, a waistcoat here, or a shirt there, or maybe a coat, whatever it might be. And if you know what it is, then you'll appreciate it. But if you don't, most people think, oh, what a great design that is. I like that. Or the guy's wearing a waistcoat. So that's something that's kind of come to me, like a lot of things, since the Sewing Bee, which I was very fortunate enough to take part in. And because the Sewing Bee likes to put your personality very much center about who you are and what you like and all that kind of stuff. So Doctor Who was there as part of it. And because of that, people then contacted me afterwards saying, can you make me this, that, or the other from the series? And that leads to a whole host of challenges of research, trying to figure out what's going on. There isn't always good pictures or clear shots of these garments to work out exactly what's going on. Sometimes there's a bit of design head logic going on to think, well, what could be going on there logically if I was to make it. Trying to locate the fabrics is very tricky sometimes. A lot of fabrics from the BBC particularly, or a lot of costume designers back in the day came from John Lewis, surprisingly. And I've heard so much about this, and I wish I could see it, but it's no longer around is John Lewis's haberdashery on Oxford Street apparently is, well, it's legendary. It was the entire ground floor of John Lewis's, and whatever they wanted, they could probably find it there. And, you know, they'd have every type of corduroy, for example, in every colour, in every size of wale, which is the little thickness of the stripes. And they could go there and get it. And so trying to find stuff is quite tricky, but quite fun to try and find the best alternative that you can to for the piece.
Yeah, it's so interesting, because I imagine another challenge would be is a garment that is used for a film or a TV production wouldn't necessarily need to be made to be worn as an everyday garment, right? So I imagine that you've got to do some thinking there about how can you make these garments that are used in television or film into something that somebody can either integrate into their daily wear, or can actually wear day to day, walking around the street, or, you know, going to some kind of event.
Absolutely, and this is the same is true for quite a lot of things. If you're talking props and what have you, sometimes things are made really well to last. If it's on your leading actor and it's got to last an entire series, you'll put a bit more of your budget into it. But if it's something that's maybe on a guest artist, or maybe just in a shorter number of episodes, or part of the film or whatever, you may not need to spend an awful lot of money on it. So like you said, some things can be made quite cheaply. There's many examples in all kinds of films. You see them on the screen, and sometimes it's special effects that can duplicate groups of actors around your screen to make it look like a massive crowd. But you still got to think, well, I've got to clothe 30 extras. Where do I get the budget from? Do I hire it? Do I make something I've got to think a bit more outside the box. There's one such Doctor Who in 1980 called The Leisure Hive, and they must have had about 20 extras hanging around, and they needed to clothe them. But it's Doctor Who, there isn't much money. So the costume designer, June Hudson, who's very shrewd, said that she put everybody in these black kind of lycra one-piece things to cover their arms and legs and their body, and then they got about 50 meters of very cheap fabric which they draped over them, and it looked really effective because they had their makeup and prosthetics, all their hair done and everything as well. But then at the opposite end of the season, they had to do the same thing again. So she got the same costumes, dyed them a different color, and then she put them onto the actors with a different prosthetic and head. No one noticed.
Very cost effective.
I know. Very clever. And she still lectures. She's still alive, and she's about 80 plus, and she still lectures and does talks about this very subject. And
yeah, I bet that's fascinating. So just bringing us back to sort of costume design, I understand that there were I think 5 of the 6 recent BAFTA nominees for the best costume design were women. So does it feel unusual to be a man in the costume world?
It's well, no, I don't. Well, I'm not sure. I don't think so. I feel quite happy with that. There are a lot of women, but then there's a lot of women in sewing generally. And my husband Clive runs a campaign called Boys Sew Too, to encourage more boys to sew, and big boys like me and the old boys to sew. And because it's not encouraged in education, it's not encouraged in schools. And when I'm teaching workshops at around the country, then if I see little kids, I'll ask them, where did you learn to sew? Quite often they'll say at home by their mum or their grandparents, usually by their grandmother. And I say, do you do it in school? The answer is quite often no. They don't really do it in school at all. But yeah, that there's a lot of quite rightly so highly praised women in film, in costume. But there's a lot of exceptionally good men as well. Ray Holman is someone who's particularly good. He's spent a number of years working on Doctor Who, and now gone off to do other things. There's a lady called Barbara Kidd who worked on Doctor Who in the 70s. She's worked on the series since, which I'd forgotten about till I read it more recently. So her whole thing's come full circle again and come back around. But yeah, for me, it's about encouraging everybody to take up this, if they want to, of course, to take up this craft of making their clothes, if they want to, and making it accessible, because it's gone from being quite normal, and you'd make your own clothes. I had an aunt who was go home, make a dress, and go out that evening in it. I mean, and it's gone the other way now. Fashion is so cheap and accessible. Someone said to me, I used to make my own clothes, but I don't bother now because it's so cheap to buy it. Why would I make it? And that's a very valid argument. It is still cheaper to buy it. But why buy it when you can make it exactly the way you want to make it, and you'll value that item and you'll wear it much more. I'll have it longer in your wardrobe if you've made it, because you won't be able to say it's gone to the charity shop, off it goes. You'll want to hang on to it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. But there's also a movement, isn't there, about people upcycling clothes as well. So they may go to charity shops and buy clothes, and then they'll then upcycle them and design them in a different way, to suit their own style.
Yeah, and I've heard someone said that they'll buy something sometimes just for the buttons, because they like the buttons on it. And that's another an old kind of habit that's kind of died away, is that people would, when they threw clothes away, because there wasn't really the charity shop network that we have now, they would cut the buttons off and they would keep the buttons, and then the garment would go. But there was a program which sounds more interesting than it was, about landfill, and they were digging up bags of rubbish with permission, don't just go and do it, from the 80s, and they could pull out clothes thrown away 40 years ago that you could just wash and put back onto your body. They hadn't decomposed in the slightest.
Yeah, amazing. I just want to bring us back just quickly before where I stop grilling you and hand us over to our watchers. But I just wanted you to talk a little bit more about the Boys Sew Too movement. So you mentioned that you and your husband Clive, the founders of Boys Sew Too movement, I've done that for a particular reason. So tell me a little bit more about that.
It came about a year ago, actually, at the Stitch Festival in Islington, which is coming up later this month, actually. And there was an Instagram friend of ours who came to do one of my workshops we'd never met before, and he did a great job, a guy called Rob Dawson. And a fortnight later, he had unfortunately passed away. Only is younger than me, he's kind of in his early 40s. So very sudden, and he looked fine. I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, he looked fine. He did the catwalk show, and he said on his catwalk show that as a kid he was encouraged not to sew, and he was told that boys don't sew, and so part of his blurb was boys sew too. And so it kind of, but after he passed away, Clive wanted to do something, so he set up Boys Sew Too. So there's been various different functions and events at a lot of these major sewing shows, and the stuff coming up at the Stitch Festival in Islington, and also Sewing for Pleasure at the NEC, which are both this month, to support, to encourage boys and men and anybody else who wants to learn to sew, or to encourage them to take it back up again, maybe to crack out the machine and to just have fun putting things together. So that's what that's about.
What a lovely memorial. So like I said, I'm going to stop grilling you now, and I'm going to come over to the villagers for some questions. So I've got a couple of questions for you. So a question from Claire: what is the most challenging costume you've been asked to design?
Well, the most challenging one, I was asked to make some trousers for Sylvester McCoy. This is a really sweet story. Sylvester played the Seventh Doctor, and he wanted a costume of his Doctor. He has owned it in the past, but he'd since sold it on, and he wanted a costume. So I made him a replica of his own trousers. And now I heard about this months before, and of course it's like, yeah, I'd absolutely love to, no problem, here's my card. He then lost the card, and then he asked a friend of mine for my details, which he passed on, and then he couldn't find them. And then it all came about again, and then I had a phone call from Sylvester while I was teaching, and I thought, well, he'll call, whoever this is, that he'll call back, or they'll call back another time. And they did, and it was Sylvester saying, can you make me some trousers? When do you need them for? 2 weeks. I'm off to Chicago. And you go, yeah, of course, not a problem. I'll make them in 2 weeks. And then my supplier for the fabric is usually really prompt, but on this occasion they didn't have it. It was down at the weavers. I think, oh my word, why is this happening now? The only time I've got a strict deadline to make it for the man himself, if you like. It was all good. I thought I'd be sewing them somewhere random around the country doing a sewing show, but I wasn't. I was able to get them done in time, and he did go to the Chicago Doctor Who event in his full costume. So that was the most challenging one, but for time scales rather than the actual make itself.
Fantastic, fantastic. We've also got a question from John. So John's question is, who was your favourite Doctor Who?
Oh, yeah. Do you know, it really does depend on the day of the week as to what I feel like. So at the moment, I've been loving John Pertwee, and there's a great story about his costume, about how it came about, because he's famous for wearing the Inverness cape and the frilly shirt and a velvet jacket, which is a very kind of late 60s kind of Mick Jagger-y kind of feel to it. Now, the story as John Pertwee told it was that he had a Radio Times photo shoot to promote him as the new Doctor. And so he went to his grandfather's trunk, pulled out a cape and a frilly shirt and a velvet jacket and put it on, and that's what he stuck to. There's been a livid costume designer since 1969 who actually specifically designed that look and put it together. I know, bless his heart. I think someone said of John Pertwee, he never let a good story get in the way of the truth. And I'm sure that some elements of what he said was true, but it was a design look, it was a considered look. And the shirts came from a fantastic shirt seller that's sadly way long gone, called Mr. Fish, who used to make these beautiful, brilliant shirts, very much of the late 60s, with zip fronts and frills and enormous collars and all kinds of fantastic stuff. Mick Jagger was the other person who used to have these same kind of shirts. But I've been commissioned to make an Inverness cape. So I know, and now I want one myself, because they just look such fun to wear with your little capelets over your arms and the long coat. It just looks perfect for the snowy weather. Well, you'll know all about Inverness capes, I'm sure. I'm sure.
Do you know what? I actually don't. But as soon as we finish this call today, I'm actually going to go and look them up, because they sound very interesting.
They do.
So I've got another question for you, and this is from Victoria. What is the most favourite costume that you have made?
Well, at the moment, it's this one here, which is a waistcoat. Now, that's a replica of one worn by Tom Baker in the mid-70s. And but the fabric is, it looks like some kind of wool check, but it's actually a velvet, and the original was velvet as well. You don't get people making printed velvet in that design, and haven't for a long time. So that comes from Spoonflower. But I've been meticulously working out the pattern, and it sounds the wrong way around, trying to work out the pattern for the garment to fit the fabric design, so that so the checks sit in exactly the right place and do exactly the right thing. Normally you do it the other way around, but in this particular case I was doing it that way around, trying to fit the pattern to the fabric, because it's quite a bold check, but that was enormous fun to do. And it's got these beautiful horn buttons on there as well. Absolutely beautiful.
It's a lovely vibrant colour, actually, and I bet you've got lots of offcuts.
I do have lots of offcuts. Yes, I don't know what I'm going to do with them yet. I daren't throw them away. I do keep offcuts, but if they're too small, then they go. But I was asked to make a waistcoat out of exactly the same fabric Matt Smith had one for, and it's a really expensive wool silk mix in kind of a scales, like fish scales kind of design, beautiful. And I made it. It's exactly the same bolt his came from, and I daren't throw the scraps away. I don't know what I'm going to do with it. I'm going to keep them, and I don't know, make something nice, or do something nice with the offcuts someday. I've got to think about that one.
Yeah, you could have a huge quilt, couldn't you, with it all?
Yes.
Or if you've got somebody who does quilting, you could make a fabulous quilt out of all of your fabrics.
That's a good idea, isn't it? I could do a Doctor Who themed quilt with all the offcuts.
There you go. There
Noted.
you go. Well, thank you to the villagers for all your questions today. And Mark, thank you so much for joining us today. I've really enjoyed our conversation. It's really been lovely to get a glimpse into the inside world of costume design.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, absolute pleasure. So if you've enjoyed this conversation today, you can find out more on Mark's love of making clothes and costumes inspired by his style icon, Doctor Who, at somarkfrancis.com. You'll find other sessions by Mark here at the Virtual Village Hall if you search at Mark Francis. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. And once again, thank you so much, Mark. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for asking me. Thank you very much.
Take care.
Cheerio.